Hey guys, so I put up a video recently. Had a bunch of people in it walking along, going through different poses. They had two separate outfits, and I did the whole thing in a single pass. Well, not a single pass, but a single rendering. And the question was presented to me recently: how did I pull that off? How can somebody manage so many facets of the same scene in a single render rather than doing it over and over again, one file after another? Well, it was suggested to me that I go ahead and put together a YouTube tutorial, which, it's not something I generally do, but it's a great idea. So without further ado, that's what we're going to discuss. We're going to start with one character out of MB Lab in this case, but it could be anything. And I will show you how to have an outfit populate its own rendering layer and animate with it, and then render to a separate set of images from the character with holdout and everything, and how you can go ahead and use this. It's really easy to do with Blender if you're making a video, but if you want to use it in a game with something like Unity, Construct, whatever you're after, that's pretty easy too. You would just want to have two separate sprite renderers, one on top of the other. And of course, this would be strictly for 2D stuff. 3D is a little different, but I think there are some things here that would carry over to it pretty well. Without further ado, though, let's get started. We'll begin with what I started with here, a basic animation created by Manuel Bastioni Lab, or MB Lab now. I don't know that it's always perfect, honestly. There's still a lot of problems that I bump into with it. Kind of like Mixamo. Mixamo's another good one, but every now and then it'll totally mangle the hands, and you're still going to have to touch it up. But they make excellent reference points when you've got a lot to do in a hurry. So the first thing I will generally do is I will consider the outfit that this guy is going to be wearing, or whatever characters, and any exposed skin, and I will highlight anywhere that I think might be exposed, head into materials, and assign an appropriate material to it. Now, this may not be necessary in this particular case, but it generally is then. I also suggest always rendering this first either in Eevee or with a very small sample count, possibly every so many frames, just to make sure there are no geometric anomalies in your model, which can be a serious problem down the line, especially if you go and turn it up to 512 or 1024 samples at 1080p or worse, and work on it all night and then find this unusable image later on. Fixing it in post is doable, but not easy, not fun, and usually pretty expensive. So, now that we have our basic human, I'm going to suggest the concept of layers to you, which is something that most Blender users likely are not entirely familiar with. We have a view layer right here at the top right corner of the screen. You can see a list of them. Generally, that's all you start with. I'm going to be renaming it to body here. And under those layers, there are a great many things that you can configure individually, which I don't think most people realize. For starters, we have the layer tab here. And I'll get into what all this is used for in a moment, but if you want a mist pass to know how far relatively everything is, or a normal pass that looks at the surface normals of all of your meshes. I'm totally blanking on what a vector pass is, but I swear it's useful. UV, denoising data, all of that. You can apply it individually per layer. And what we're going to do today is we're going to have one layer for the body and another for the clothing. And my first thought when considering that was, okay, well, what if the arm brushes in front of the clothing? Isn't it going to overwrite it? Not necessarily, actually. We have a option on our collections called holdout here, and I'm going to go ahead and enable indirect only as well. That's the other important one, which will cause a certain collection to not render, but to be treated as transparent when something within it is contacted. I'll show you what that means in just a moment. Let's start by creating some very half-baked clothing here. Let's see, I'm just going to switch to edge mode and grab that and grab, whoops, there we go. just grab that too. F3, select loop inner region. Okay, so normally this is not the best way to do clothing, although it's a possibility for some of them. I need to highlight a few things here. After you've selected the region you want clothing over, hold down Shift and D to duplicate it. And now we want to scale it up so it's a little bit above the actual mesh. And one mistake a lot of people will make is simply to set our origin to the median point and scale it accordingly. Don't do that. It doesn't work how you think it does. The median point itself is... Actually, you know what? First up, let's part that by selection. I want to work on an ordinary mesh here. Okay, so if we wanted to see where our median point was, we would do cursor to selected. And... Nope, I need to do that in edit mode. Sorry, guys. And apparently it's over the groin region here, but you'll notice that not everything is equidistant from that. So when we scale it, not only is it not necessarily going to be away from the true center point we would want for clothing, but it may even self-collide, which is a serious issue for animation. You want to avoid those for as long as you can, because they're way easier to get in than they end up being to get out of it. So, in order to scale, we're going to want to do Alt-S. What that does is it scales along the normal. And we want to do that just a little bit. There we go. Just so it isn't perfectly on top of it. Now, here's a mistake I was making for quite a while. First thing you'll want to do is, of course, get rid of all your MB Lab materials. But the next thing you're going to want to do is, other than the armature, you want to get rid of all of the different modifiers it adds there, too. Those are specifically for flesh and skin. They do not make sense for any kind of clothing. So we will get rid of them. And now there are a few other things I want to get rid of, like the belly button here makes no sense for a pair of pants. So I will be grabbing these two. Why does it not want to grab that particular vertex? Filling that in, subdividing once, go back into solid mode, and grab these edge loops and fill them in. Now we've got something that's going to deform much better. Now there are some other problems here, such as you can already see a spot where the groin area has self-intersected. Give me just a moment to straighten that out now to save myself a world of trouble later. Okay guys, I just took care of that for you here. I didn't bother to record it as it's not really central to what we're talking about here. Basically I just went over it with a little bit of sculpting until I got rid of any artifacts visible there. Now that may not always be enough for multiple reasons. I always encourage you to go ahead and try and drag your armature bones around just to see if you see anything weird going on in any standard poses. Now here we've got a very clear one, which is that the waist is moving way too much with the thigh. And granted, that would only really rotate along a few axes, but I'm not comfortable with it. So the first thing I suggest doing is parenting it to the armature and selecting automatic weights, just in case that got screwed up. And if you're lucky, that'll take care of it for you. Took care of some of it, but it's usually not enough. There's one option here, of course, to go into weight paint and attempt to make minor modifications for each of your vertex groups, but there are a few problems there. Chiefly, at this point, clearly the number of vertex groups to worry about. There's only a few of them that really have any effect, but the bigger problem is I honestly just find this to be a little clunky and unresponsive even on my machine. And there's an easier way which is the shrink wrap modifier. Now, I swear this is what this must have been originally created for. It is so perfect for this occasion. What it does is it takes all of the vertices, edges, and faces of your mesh and sets them to be a certain distance along the normal from another mesh based on their proximity. So here, MAF01, male African 1, I'm assuming, is going to be our target. And the first problem you're going to bump into is it glued to it perfectly, and we've got all of this Z fighting going on, but that's alright, we can fix that. Nearest surface point is usually enough. If you've got something funny going on, you can try some of the other ones, but we want it to be above surface. And let's just go with 0.01 meters or 1 centimeter for now. In fact, we can get even closer than that. 0.005, half a centimeter. And there's a good chance... No, we cannot. That'll do. Now there are some artifacts which you need to be aware of, such as right here. Sometimes you can get around that by changing the wrap method. Ooh, that sure as heck didn't do it. Most of the time I find this to be relatively irrelevant in the long run, as it's a minor issue. We generally have much bigger problems when we're finishing off an animation. Now watch what happens when I attempt to rotate it now that I've got shrink wrap going. Much better, and as you can see, that one point where we're dealing with a little confusion as to which vertex is closest, outside of extreme cases that are anatomically impossible anyway, we seem to have a decent model here. So I'm going to do this one more time for a shirt. And once again, I want to emphasize that there are certain parts of the body that this does not work with at all. Anywhere that's got a tremendous amount of detail. If you've got elbows or knees on there, they're going to be a problem. Belly button, all kinds of crap on the face. The reality is, if you want to do a proper piece of clothing that is not meant to be form-fitting, you should always do it like we do it in the real world and start with a pattern. I will cover that in a future lecture, as it's way to the left of what I'm talking about right now. But if you just need something done fast, this is a great way to do it. So let's grab a few of these, make sure they're all the way around. Actually, even better, I'm going to turn on symmetry with X. And damn, that did not work. Okay, it was worth a shot. Just grab that. Also, always look for wonky things that are necessary for the geometry of the body, which will be unnecessary for your clothing. There are quite a few of them. There we go. Shift D. Part by selection. There we go. I was going to say, I could swear I hit tab. And let me get rid of all of these. And I'm also going to, once again, remember the corrective smooth, the subdivision, and the displacement are meant for skin and flesh, not clothing. So you'll want to just get rid of those. Don't just toggle them off. They're not going to help you again. Just ditch them. Now that I'm looking at this, I should make at least a minor effort to make it look like an actual shirt. I thought that might be a problem. And let me just ditch those faces. Solid 1, 2, 3, 4. See, I should have started with the shirt. Way better behaved, less complicated geometry, especially in that A pose or a T pose. Either one will work. After that, I'm going to go ahead and start by re-adding my shrink wrap modifier. And once again, we're after MF01 here. Let's try that. And just to see if I need to reparent it, which is not something I ever want to do if I don't have to. This is what happens when you tap the axis twice, by the way. It'll go by the local axis of the pose. I'm sorry, the armature. The bone. Even, Michael, pull yourself together, man. Alright. So one thing I did notice there is I have not yet renamed these, so let's just give them my basic shorts. That's two of them. Well, one, but still. Alright, and now let's just give these a nice cotton look. So this is halfway reasonable. Some kind of a fiber. Cotton, cotton. Let me switch to rendered. Yeah, that works. Alright. So that would be the end of part one, where we actually get together our body and basic outfit here. And I'll be coming back to do another one in a little bit, but now we need to discuss something called collections. Collections aren't actually as new a concept as many people believe. They've actually been a part of Blender for a long time now, but they had a major refit as of 2.8, as a great deal of the interface did. And what's important to remember about them is they're not just for organization for you. They certainly can be. I think they should be. But they have distinct and intrinsic meanings to your rendering layer as well. We're going to be adding a new one here for our clothing. We'll call this outfit.000. The next one's going to be 001 or 100, depending on how much I think it's changed. And we're going to go ahead and drag our shirt and shorts into it. I generally suggest having everything that is meant to be rendered together combined under the same collection. And when we add our new view layer here, which you can do with the new button, which I'm also going to be naming outfit.000 for the sake of consistency. When you go between these two, everything changes as far as how our collections are managed in the final render. So for this, we do want our actual character to remain enabled, especially since the armature is in there too, and who knows what's going to happen with that. But we don't actually want it to be rendered. So we would use something called holdout. In fact, just for the sake of clarity, let me go ahead and turn on transparency under film. There we go. You can see something interesting has happened here. It's very clear, as you can see from the lack of our lattice here, that everything that is in that layer has gone completely transparent. When it bumps into it, it just knows to go no further. Sorry, these triangles are bugging me like crazy, but I guess I don't need to worry about them too much for the sake of this tutorial. And yet, everything that I have relative to those objects is also behaving well. And the other thing you might notice is that if something is behind it, that is also considered transparent on holdout. In other words, it's just saying that whatever happens, if you bump into this collection, it is not going to be a part of this render. However, if I jump back to body, suddenly it's all available again. It won't do any good to have the clothing and the body as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to head over to this. We're going to go to the camera there and disable it in renders. In other words, it won't even consider it. We will also want to disable it in the viewport by hitting the eye. So this is our character himself. I could really stand to mess with the lighting a bit, but honestly, that might be a great place for indirect only. And if I go to outfit, I have got this. The interesting thing about doing it this way is I could render it once with the body and again with the clothing in any pose, mind you, because they're both fit to the same armature. And then I can composite them over each other by having this rendered on top of the body. And you will have exactly the same result as if they were both done in one pass. Alright, and in the interest of explaining that other item I enabled, the indirect only, that actually involves lighting. If I add another mesh here, let's go ahead and make it plain for simplicity's sake. Head into my materials, create a new material, and set its surface to emission. I may as well recenter it at the origin. And then let's go into edit mode, scale it out, say 20 times. And I want to turn the strength up to maybe 2.5, so lit from below, which is a great trick when you're trying to do something scary, by the way. People don't know they're seeing it, but they do. And they find it a little unsettling. But not in a cheap way, like a jump scare. And we're going to go ahead and turn this new layer to lighting for the outfit and for the body. I want this to be set to indirect only. Let's see, I want my plane to be in there. Yeah, there we go. As you can see, the outfit is now lit, but we don't actually see the lighting. This is what indirect only is about. It means all of the meshes and curves and NURB surfaces, all of that should be affected by whatever it is that this material is doing, but don't worry about rendering the material itself. We'll want to do this for body as well. Remember, you can't do it to all of them at once unless you're doing some kind of neat Python trick. Glow's a little intense around the edges, but you know what? I'm going to tolerate it. Okay, so let's go to our render layers tab, which is this set of, I guess there's supposed to be photos or something there. Every one of them that you want to have rendered, you should have set to use for rendering. Use for rendering will send it to the compositor during our render, each in its own pass. We'll want to add every piece of data we think we're going to use. I'm going to go ahead and throw denoising data on both of them. Simply because I do not want to wait through 512 passes just to make sure we're rid of all the fireflies. In fact, I am on cycles at the moment. This will technically also work on Eevee just fine. Well, let's go back to layers. I won't have any use for mist, normal, factory, data. Okay, that's the important part. Now let's head over to the compositor. Most of you are familiar with the compositor, if you're familiar with it, with this simple trick, which is Blender's AI denoising. Albedo, image, normal, albedo, and composite. We're going to be doing something a little different today, though. Ditch the composite node. It's not how we're rendering this. We are instead going to do file output here. And you will note at the beginning that our image comes in as a render layer on the compositor. In this case, body. Now we will need actually two of them. This is going to be a relatively complicated compositor graph, and it does just get more complicated with time as you add more features to it, but I'll go over that at the end. You should have body in a folder called body and outfit.000 in a folder you call outfit.000. You don't have to technically, I just strongly recommend it, mostly for the sake of staying organized. Same thing goes with the view layers and the collections. The whole idea is so that you can find it at the end of the day and that you use a consistent system. That's what I did here, and that's what we'll be doing forward for the sake of the rest of the presentation. Now I'm going to hit F12 and render it, and you can watch what happens here. Outfit. Oh, excuse me, I made a mistake here. I'm sorry, guys. When you toggle rendering or view, it toggles across all of the view layers, every single one of them, which is really confusing because things like holdout do not toggle across view layers. They're specific to that view layer. What you want to do instead is this checkbox. That means exclude from that layer. So now I've toggled it off without toggling it off everywhere. There we go. Now, as you can see here, let me jump back to body real quick and make sure that's working out. This is why I always start with a single render, and while we're at it, let's make this 640 by 480. Just keep it nice and stupid. And honestly, 256 by 256 has been the ideal for graphics cards for years. I kind of wonder why it isn't already the default, but I guess I can do that myself. So here's body. There's the outfit. You should have body in a folder called body and outfit.000 in a folder you call outfit.000. You don't have to technically, I just strongly recommend it, mostly for the sake of staying organized. But to reiterate, we have two render layers here, one for body, one for outfit. Both are denoised. That's purely optional. Your render may not require that. And they both go straight to a file output. If I combine these two, which I can actually do in a really haphazard way here in the compositor by doing this, just adding input from image, and we are going to go to my external drive where I put these, go into models, demo, start with body. I'm going to duplicate that and grab a second one from the outfit. Then I will use a specific filter under color called alpha over. Your order can be very important here. Now we'll want an actual viewer here. I can just tie it in, we can see it in the background, and that's going to be our final result there. You can take two different movies or strips of images, sounds, whatever you'd like, and modify one on the basis of the other, which totally transforms what Blender is capable of. So, looking at our animation real quick, I just rigged this together. It's just a quick sprint here, and obviously it's doing all the calculations, so this is not running at full speed. So for our initial render, I'm going to highlight something to you under the output properties. That's the little printer label there. We've got frame start, end, and something called step. That is every number of frames you want to use, or you want to skip between renders. So if I do 5 and it starts at 1, it'll start with 1. Then it'll move 5 frames to 6, then 11, then 16, and so on, until finally the new frame is beyond the end of it. Grabbing something like that, just when you're not 100% sure about the outfit, at a low resolution and low quality is a great way to solve for any potential problems down the road. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and render my animation and see how this works out. If all of these do work out, and I am confident enough, I will do this at 1080p, and then we will learn how to composite it together in the video sequence editor, which is honestly something that doesn't get nearly enough attention. They have a tab for it, actually, but it's not even in by default. And during that, since it can take a while, I usually suggest heading down to a gym, or there's a coffee shop that's about 1.5 miles away from me that I'll walk out to, just to get a little bit of exercise, as we spend a lot of time in our studios. And it helps to just get in touch with the real world for a little while, just how everything looks and feels in our waking universe, outside of whatever fantasy we're putting together with our models, and possibly for its benefit. Just jump into models here. Clothing demo. I can look at some of these now. Alright, see, there's a problem right there. My camera. I suppose I can stop the render at this point, because I already know what my issue is. I'm going to go ahead and add a new keyframe for the camera back at the beginning. And at the end, I want it to be over here. There we go. Let's go ahead and look at our outfit too, just to see if we have any glaring issues just yet. Doesn't look like it, but since I'm not entirely certain yet, let's go ahead and render that animation one more time with our camera moving. And once again, I remind you, this is only every 6 frames at low resolution. There's always this lingering temptation to do it at maximum resolution the first time through and to expect everything to be okay. But in actuality, that's almost never the case, even in a professional studio. And we need to prepare for it. In fact, you'll even see a lot of this early stuff going on in trailers right now, possibly on account of the COVID pandemic. It's really been slowing everything down in Hollywood. If you look at the new trailer for Far From Home, there's a point where the lizard gets punched in the face by what looks like thin air. And the whole reason for that is there might be another Spider-Man in there that just hasn't been composited in yet. We don't know. We'll find out when the movie comes out. Marvel is actually kind of famous for compositing things differently in a trailer compared to the actual movie anyway, so for all I know, it might have even been intentional. I'm kind of excited. Okay. 1920 by 1080, and I will want to set my step back to 1. It's always good to consider your frames per second early. I think 30 is going to do it for me. But if I wanted this to be 60 and I did it all as images, granted the images themselves do not have a timestamp, but I would have to screw with it in the VSE. And I prefer for everything to just be ready to go at that point. So we'll get to the VSE in a moment. I'm going to hit Control F12 and get this rendering on full, and no, I didn't really play with my sample count either. It doesn't seem necessary here. It's just a tutorial. I might in actuality. And when I come back sometime later, I'm going to head to the gym here. Okay, I'm back. Let's get into our video sequence editor. Went for a good run. Let's probably have a snack in a bit, but let's jump back here. Okay, the video sequence editor is meant to work with exactly that, final videos. In it, there are a number of different clips you can add in a very familiar looking track format down here, including, if we head down there and hold Shift A, hit Shift A since we no longer have screencast keys, you'll notice that we've got entire scenes. I'm not actually entirely sure what a clip is. Masks, which are useful for the many interesting effects in here, and filters, which you may not be unaware of existing within Blender. A full movie, sound, and image sequence, which we're about to do. Adjustment layers, effects strips. These are a bit more scarce than I would like as far as their variety, but they're quite useful. Solid colors, text. Well, let's go to image sequence here first. And the moment, yeah, there we go. External, I was looking at the wrong drive. Let's start with our body. You can open that up and hit A to select every single one of them. I'm seeing it's about to load them in the wrong order, so I'm going to change the ordering here. And then add image strip. And you'll notice that our video has each frame in turn from that render. Now we'll add a second image sequence for the outfit. Add image strip. Now there's a problem here, as you can see, as one of them is overwriting the other entirely, including its alpha. To get around that, we will head over here under Compositing to Blend and transform it from cross to alpha over. And now check it out. We now have an animation which has previously not existed, of the man running with the clothing. A few spots I could touch up, but nothing too serious. Again, this is why we always start with a low quality render. So from here, as long as I've got anything in this at least, and it doesn't default to our view layer, I can simply go to Output, choose a proper location for it. Let's call this animation.000 and set my output file format to something like FFmpeg. It's one of my favorites. Make sure you've got a satisfactory video encoding, and if you've got any audio in the video sequence editor, remember to choose an audio codec. AAC usually does it for me, but each of these has something special about it. There's almost always an occasion. So now that we've got that, Trosca will work. Render animation. Give it just a moment here. There you have it, people. In the next part, I'm going to create a separate outfit for this character using the same cheap method I used before, and show that you can actually also render new layers of clothing without actually having to worry about re-rendering the body and the other layers of the clothing. Give me just a moment to cut away and create that outfit, and I will be right back with this very helpful advice. Returning to it, I have a very basic outfit here. Probably nowhere near something that I'd want to use in a final product, but good beginning. And there are a few clips here I want to make you aware of, like right there, that's apparently penetrating the mesh of the body. So that's something you might want to address later on. But I really just want an example of using two different outfits here with something passable. Pair of pants, more or less. You know, my next video really should be on using patterns for stuff like this. But as you can see, it is rendering properly. If I just pause it here, we'll see the ray trace. And I am going to make a few adjustments. Just to reiterate, the suspenders and the pants have shrink wrap applied to them on the same object at 7.5 millimeters. They've both been mapped to the armature. For the suspenders, I actually modeled them from just a circle rather than trying to take them off of the body because the faces are just too disorganized for that. So that I did want to parent to the armature here and have automatic weight set. Now for our actual scene, there are a few things to check. First off, turn off your other outfit. You don't want it rendering on there. Lighting with indirect only is just fine. You will want the collection with your armature in it to be enabled, but on a holdout, as it also has the body. It is possible to just put the armature in an entirely different collection. And then finally, outfit.100 is this new one. In fact, I should actually rename the layer to coincide with that, where we have our pants and suspenders. And of course, make sure that this is set to use for rendering, so it renders. Next up, we will jump back over to our compositor, duplicate one of these. Whoops, excuse me, that's the viewer. Duplicate one of these. Set it to the appropriate layer. And after denoising, we will want it in a new folder. I'm going to head up one and create outfit.100. Now my consistency with these names is not something you necessarily have to do, but I strongly recommend it as it will make things much easier to find. Lastly, make sure your file format is set back to PNG, or if you're doing something complicated, possibly even OpenEXR or OpenEXR multilayer. PNG will do it for me for now. And uncheck overwrite. That's one way of ensuring that you don't actually cover up any of your previous work. But there's another method, and that is simply to go to each of the other outfits and turn off use for rendering with them. If use for rendering is not used, then it will be completely ignored in the compositor, which is what we want here. After that, I am going to save, and finally render animation. Whoops, I made a mistake though, and can you guess what it was? I just hit escape, jump over to video editing. I didn't get rid of those. Render animation now. Now again, this would be a great time to go ahead and do it with a minor animation first, something in just NTSC at 30 samples per frame, or Eevee and just ray trace it. The only hesitation I have about Eevee is that it is not technically a ray tracing engine, which means there are certain problems that cycles can have, which Eevee never has to worry about. The downside is you end up getting a lower quality render. And for many cases, even in production, that's fine. If it's just something simple but with a lot of complication on it, and you don't want to spend all day rendering something people will have milliseconds maybe to look at, that is perfectly okay to use Eevee. But for the heavy-duty stuff, I learned on cycles. It's what I continue to use. and I really don't have any complaints with it. In fact, as of Cycles X coming out soon, it looks like everybody's going to love it again. Alright, that is frame 6 out of 40 something. I'm going to go grab a snack. See you guys in a moment. Okay, now that we've finished rendering, let's go ahead and check our images real quick just to make sure there's nothing wrong here. And there doesn't appear to be. Again, you would usually do this at a relatively low resolution and sample count, or just use a ray tracer like Eevee the first time around, especially for more complicated models. That seems to be working out. If we head over to the video sequence editor, which I've emptied out for the sake of creating a new outfit. In fact, I will usually actually have a separate file that contains the video sequence editor, simply for the sake of consistency. We will go into body. I recognize that screencast does not work in the VSE or the file browser, so I'll try and be clear. I hit A to select all, add image strip. And another thing to note with this is the file at the top will be the first frame in an animation. The bottom will be the last. So if you end up loading them from 45 through 1, it's going to play backwards. Bear that in mind. Then I will hit Shift D to duplicate it, just like a mesh, move it over and release. You'll note that I have moved from a 45 frame animation to 90 here. Perhaps I should have done that on camera. And as you can see, this is the same thing twice, which is good because it allows us to demonstrate the usefulness of this. If I go into outfit.0, add image strip. Sorry guys. Outfit.000 and add image strip, then set to alpha over. We will have our original animation. And now if I go into outfit.100, hit A to select all and add image strip, and also drop it down and make sure it's on that same line, and once again select from blend. All of these different options have their use in time, by the way. But what we'll be mostly using is alpha over here. And as you can see, we have the exact same animation with a new set of clothing on it. If I go to my output here and select the format of FFmpeg again and render this animation, let's head back over here, go up a few. Seem to have misplaced that folder. But as you can see. Okay. So that covers just about everything for fitting clothing onto an individual. The truth is you may actually have other things you want to do beyond that later on, such as another character that uses the same armature. Piece of cake. You'll have to make minor adjustments, but that's actually what I did for the animation I'd thrown up before. I'll try and throw a link to it at the end of the video. Different body types, if they're close enough, sometimes you barely need to change anything at all. It'll just work. Other times you may need to do a little bit more expansion along normals. That's Alt-S again. Or adjust some of the finer vertices. And I really do need to emphasize if you're using MBLab, and remember this for any other tool you might be using just to get the ball rolling with your humanoid model. Go over your modifiers, see if you actually need them. Try toggling them on and off even, just to see if there's any visible difference. If you forget to do that, there's a possibility that a later deformation on the mesh, some other modifier, may actually cause the mesh to expand or even destructively contract through the boundary you've already set on it. Moreover, I'd like to highlight that the shrink wrap modifier does have a vertex group option on it. If you just want part of the mesh, this is especially good with things like, say, a skirt as an example, to hug the form, but the rest of it to kind of hang loosely, you can do that too. I'm going to wrap it up here, though. It's already been a very long video, and it took me most of the day to edit it. Hopefully I've got this OBS thing figured out now. Sorry about some of the blurbs with a little bit of it being off screen. I tried to keep as much as I could visible. See what I come up with next time. Don't forget to subscribe if you like this, and check out my Patreon. Thanks, guys.